almost the whole third chapter of Daniel. Before we jump in, I think it's going to be helpful if we can have a little bit of context and understanding of what is going on with the book of Daniel. First of all, it's necessary for us to understand that Daniel was written around 160 BC. However, the main character, or one of the main characters of the story that was just shared, that was read by Kathy, is about King Nebuchadnezzar. The thing is King Nebuchadnezzar was king and ruler about 400 years earlier. It was King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon that came into Jerusalem and would force God's chosen people out of Jerusalem and to go up to Babylon and to live in exile. It was King Nebuchadnezzar that would come in and would overthrow Jerusalem and the temple would fall. It was King Nebuchadnezzar that pushed all of them, God's people, from there up to Babylon. But we're 400 years later. So what's going on? Well, the truth is this book of Daniel is folklore. Kind of like Babe and the Blue Ox or Jack and the Beanstalk. The writer of Daniel recognized and realized that God's people, who were still living in oppression, still living in exile, needed laughter. You know, the old saying goes, if things are so bad, you can either laugh or cry, and you might as well laugh. Thanks, Gil. That's my goal every Sunday, so we can take that one off there. That's exactly what's going on here. The people are living in a very similar situation. They are living in oppression. They are having to live under the rule of the king who is governing them. And ultimately, just like King Nebuchadnezzar did, ultimately said that you have to worship our gods and you have to worship me. And as you can imagine, year after year after year after year after year of having to live with that, you are living in constant tension with yourself. You know that your God has commanded and demanded, first and foremost, right out of the gates, that you should have no other God before me. That's commandment number 1. However, the ruler that they're living under says, well, no, you need to worship me and you need to worship our gods. And so there's this moral, ethical, theological tension that's taking place. And in order to break the imagination back open for God's people, Daniel writes this story about Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know it's supposed to be humorous right out of the gates. The first verse talks about this golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar builds. And it's 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never used cubits as a unit of measurement, so I can't really grasp it. Those that do understand it say that the statue is 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Okay? You start to get some of the humor that the writer has built. Like, nobody's going to build a 90-foot statue. The majority of humans are not going to build a 90-foot statue of themselves, even if they're the king or ruler of a great nation. Right? But King Nebuchadnezzar did. But he didn't stop there. He said, every time you hear the drums and the tambourines and the little wrist bells and the flutes and the clarinets, all of the ensemble, you need to stop wherever you are. You need to fall on the ground and you need to worship the statue. Come on. And he called all of the leaders, the verses 2 through 7 that we took out, all of the leaders come and he gives this decree. This is exactly what is supposed to happen when the flutes and the clarinet and the drums and the tambourines and blah, 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 all of that is being played. You fall down and worship me. I was wondering, maybe like in the morning if they needed to do exercises, they just use this as like burpees. So that, like they're playing the sound and then they drop down and worship and then they're back up and there it goes again and now they're down. It doesn't say that in the Bible, but sometimes we have to have fun. Thanks, Gil. That's 2 in one day. I'm on a roll. King Nebuchadnezzar, in his great ego, puts out this decree. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Jewish, are Israelites. They're God's chosen people. And they know that the command is to not worship any other God. And so verses 8 through 30 that was read, the decree comes out, and a couple of the king's workers come and tattle on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they say, "Oh, King, mighty King, may you reign and rule forever. You are the best thing ever." We got to tell you about some naughty boys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't doing what you told them to do. My words here, they're resisting this authority. They are pushing back against this decree. And they knew the punishment. The punishment was they were going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar, because these three have made this mistake, makes a decision, the normal heat of the fiery furnace isn't enough. We better crank it up. So it says they crank it up 7 times. I mean, I know there isn't a control. They would have turned back then. But whatever fuel, the fuel is piled on. It's burning 7 times higher and hotter than it typically does. And in goes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they make a decision to stand for something they believe in. Because King Nebuchadnezzar, this ruler, whose power and authority and ego seems to be bigger than anything else, who that when somebody steps up to him and pushes back, he's filled with great anger. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are brought to him, he's so furious with him, it says his face was distorted. Because they pushed against his authority. They pushed against that rule. They made a decision that the things they believe in, the things that they've been taught, the things that they know to be true, are more important than what this great ruler was demanding for them to do. The powerful thing of the story that was written, and again, this was written to bring a sense of laughter and relief for the people, and to remind God's people of one of the fundamental reminders that is laced throughout all of Scripture. God didn't prevent Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to have to go into this fiery furnace, but instead God met them there. So they weren't prevented from having to go in, but in the midst of their trouble, the distress, the 7 times hotter than it typically burns, that's where God shows up. Reminding God's people who are under oppression and who are having to live under the reign of a king at that time to continue to push up against. God isn't going to come and set them free from that oppression, but God is going to meet them there. Stand true, resist, push back against those places where your morals and ethics and theology are disagreeing with the one in authority. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I think, is a powerful, powerful story for us today. Dr. Martin Luther King, when he was arrested and put into the Birmingham jail, he sent a letter from the jail to all the pastors in the United States, and he talks about this text. I read you just one paragraph of it. Dr. King writes, "Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evident sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. of an act recognizing and acknowledging that just because a ruler or a law of the land is there, that if that doesn't fall in line with your understanding of how we all ought to live and treat one another, there is pushback, there is resistance, there is civil disobedience, as Dr. King talks about. To call us to task and to make us aware of these places where this has happened. For King, it was obvious that the African Americans living in our country at that time had both laws that prevented them from living an abundant life, from where they could drink water, where on the bus they could sit, which diners they could go to, or schools they could attend. And then there were all these other unwritten laws of, well, that's just how it's always been, that were also rule of the land. That the civil rights movement was to begin to break open the need for change, the need for transformation. And I hope you all recognize and understand that work is not done. We still have work to do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ought to be encouragers for us as disciples of Christ as we continue to be made aware of those places where our morals and ethics push up against these rules and these laws that are just in place because maybe they always have been. I think about Matt Lauer, the former, thank goodness, former host of the Today Show. I think this is another Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moment in our history where finally these men are being taken to task for the mistreatment of their female colleagues. This idea that women are less than men and that they can be objects and subjects of those who are higher than them. Because, well, it's just boys being boys. Or that's just how we've always done it around here. I know it's a little weird, but that's done. As Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego people, we're not going to allow this anymore. We have a God who sent Jesus into this world. And in John's Gospel, Jesus reminds us that He has come into this world so that all may have abundance. If we have women in the workplace who don't feel like they have the opportunity to advance like their male colleague or have to continually to be subject of harassment in that place, in work or wherever it is, we are not done. That is not abundant life, even if it's just, well, that's how it's always been. This is a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moment, I think. We are being called, and we need to continue to push up against those rules that don't fall in line with our theological understanding and our moral and ethical understanding. We can't allow it anymore. And so when these voices come up and these brave victims begin to tell their story, we ought to listen. We need to pay attention. And to recognize that whatever authority is governing that in those places, that it doesn't sit right with us as Christians, as brothers and sisters living in community, in a church body that is desiring all to live an abundant life. We have to show up. We have to push back. We have to be the voice of support. Because I think if in this season of Advent and in our own preparation for the celebration of Christ to come, that we remember the gift that Jesus is to us, and that the gift is a gift of abundance. That we all might live a life of abundance. If it's for our African American brothers and sisters and the work that King did to make sure that we began a path towards equality, we don't stop that work. It needs to keep going. If it's the mistreatment of women in the workplace and in our community, we are not done. We have to keep going. For the mistreatment of immigrants in our country as if they don't belong, we have to push back and resist and keep going. These are God's children. We can be the Shadrachs, Meshachs, and Abednegos. There may be rules passed, there may be restrictions put in place, but that doesn't mean we have to step down. And that when we step up, when we push back, we are reminded it's in that place and in that moment that God is present with us, journeying with us, encouraging us, supporting us. Brothers and sisters, I don't know what your Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moment looks like. Maybe it's one I've named, maybe there's something else going on. But we as the body of Christ, called disciples of Christ, need to continue to do the work before us. Because I fully believe this babe child whose birth we will celebrate came to give you and me and everyone life in an abundant life. May we be so encouraged and bold to help work so all might know that. Thanks be to God.
Amen.